You'll never have rest if you don't have trust. Trust leads to rest. Yeshua tests his disciples in John chapter 6, and it says this: afterwards, Yeshua went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. In Hebrew, it says, Vayehi acharei chen vayetze Yeshua el Ever Yam HaGalil Asher Letaviria. Okay, so afterwards, Yeshua goes to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also known as the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following because they were watching the signs he was performing on the sick. Then Yeshua went up the mountainside and sat down there with his disciples. Passover, the Jewish feast, was near. Lifting up his eyes and seeing a large crowd coming to him, Yeshua said to Philip, "Where will we buy bread so that these may eat?" Now, Yeshua was saying this to test him, test Philip, test the disciples, for he knew what he was about to do, right? So we read this, Ve'ach lenasot oto diber zot kihu yada et asher yaaseh. For this lenasot, to test, lenasot, to test them, because he knew what he was going to do. So to understand this miracle and the associated test, one of the things we have to do is we need to look more deeply at the details and the context over the next few weeks, because we don't want to stay at the surface. We want to mine the depths of what this text is telling us, okay? So there was 5,000 men, probably about 10,000 or so people. There wasn't enough food for them. Yeshua asked his disciples, how are we going to feed them, right? Philip is like, there's no way possible. No way. Even if we had the money, we're not close enough to big enough villages. Most of the villages, remember, he was out in the wilderness. Most of the towns around him were 100, 200 people. They didn't have a lot. And there's a detail that we read later that the grass was green. Like, this was Passover. This was the end of the season where the grain for the year would have been consumed, right? So people had been running out of grain, and you couldn't eat the first fruits of the new grain until after the second day of Passover, when the first fruits was offered to God. Only after the first fruits could you eat the grain for the new season, right? So for many reasons, there was like there's no possible way. And then Andrew, the brother of Peter, says, well, the best we got, there's a kid over here. He's got 5 loaves and 2 fish, but kind of what's that with so many people, right? But this was a test. But the question is that we have to ask ourselves is, why does Yeshua test the disciples in this way? And what's the connection between the miracle, the multiplication of the bread and the fish, and the testing that they're experiencing, right? So the first thing we need to understand this test and this miracle is we have to understand the context, right? Not the contest, but the context, right? And remember, this is around Passover, when Israel had been led forth out of Egypt and they go into the wilderness. And these guys are in the wilderness of the Galilee. They're in a rural area, okay? And this is what we read, Deuteronomy. You are to remember all the way that Adonai your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, in order to humble you, to test you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his mitzvot, his commandments, or not. He afflicted you and let you hunger, then he fed you manna, which neither you nor your fathers had known, in order to make you understand that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes out of the Father's mouth. Wow, right? So in the same way God tested Israel in regards to bread, right? He fed them in a way, right? They ran out of bread. How are they going to eat? Were they going to starve in the wilderness? There was nowhere to get bread around them. God tests the disciples in the same way that he tested Israel. And God always tests us for the purpose of teaching and training. Right? The word here for test comes from the word nisayon. And nisayon comes from the word which is connected to the word nasa, to lift up, right? And so, or, kind of a banner. So in the same way that banners were lifted up, the testing is never to break us down or to beat us up, but it's always to lift us up, because when we pass the test, we go to the next spiritual level. And so testing is always training for reigning. It's always training for the next spiritual level that God wants to bring us to, right? So he's teaching the disciples. What is he teaching the disciples? He's teaching his disciples to have complete dependence upon him. To understand that in the same way God provided in the wilderness, the Lord would provide through him. But there's more, right? So basically, Philip says, listen, all the money can't solve the problem. There's no solution to the situation. Philip is like, get real. There's no way we're going to feed 10,000 people. And Andrew, Peter's brother, he's like, listen, I've got these 5 loaves and 2 fish, right? I don't know what we can do with that, but we got them. And so the disciples were looking for a natural solution to solve the situation. They were looking for a natural solution to solve the situation. One of the lessons that Yeshua was trying to teach the disciples is that you can't pass a spiritual test or solve a spiritual problem by natural means. You can't pass a God test in the natural, right? And this was the whole point of Yeshua's request. He wanted to teach them, like Israel in the wilderness, the disciples would have to learn to lean upon the Lord and trust him to supernaturally provide for their needs, both material and spiritual, even when it seemed impossible. Were the disciples going to learn to trust Yeshua and pass the test that the majority of the children of Israel failed in the wilderness? So it's significant, and this is right, the mystery of the 7, right? The mystery of 6-7. It's significant that there were 5 loaves and 2 fish, which totals the number 7, because the number 7 is connected to provision. Okay, think about it for a moment. 7 is connected to provision. 7 is also the number of rest and trust. Rest, trust, and provision are all connected to the number 7. Think about it for a moment. On 5 days of the week, Monday through Thursday, when the children of Israel were in the desert, God gave them manna. But the manna was only good for the day, and it became rotten and putrid if they tried to eat it the next morning. So they're only meant to collect enough for the day and not to keep it overnight. And this was meant to teach the children of Israel that they had to trust God for their daily bread. But then on the 6th day, God does the exact opposite, right? On the 6th day, they had to collect a double portion, one to eat on Friday and the other to eat on Saturday. So on the 6th day, they had to keep the portion overnight and trust that it wouldn't rot and it would be fresh and good the entirety of the Shabbat day. And so they collected enough on the 6th day for all of the 7th day. But the question is why? It's about rest and trust. God did not want them to work, but to worship and rest on Shabbat. So God gives them the double portion. And then they go into the land of Israel, right? They go into the promised land eventually, those 40 years later, they go into the promised land. and the manna stops. And God says, if you're faithful to obey everything that I've commanded you to today, I will bring the early and the latter rains. Read Deuteronomy chapter 11. And, you'll eat, you'll have grass in your field, and you'll eat and you'll be satisfied, and all these blessings will come upon you. So the thing about the land of Israel is that it's not like Egypt, where there's a natural overflow of the Nile that creates this rich soil. God had to provide the perfect amount of rain for there to be the right amount of food, right? Too little rain, famine. Too much rain, famine, because it would destroy the crops as well, okay? And so they had to trust God. They had to trust God, and if they obeyed his commandments and faithfully followed him, he would provide them, and they'd always have enough, right? Their storehouses would be full. The manna was to test the Israelites, the children of Israel, to see what was in their hearts. But similarly, God gave a test to the children of Israel when they went into the land. What was that test? That test was the sabbatical year. So 6 years, the children of Israel could work the ground. And the 7th year was known as the Shemitah. And one aspect of the Shemitah, of the sabbatical year, was that the farmers were not allowed to work the ground in the 7th year, which means they had to trust God for the provision for the 7th year, and had to trust God for provision going into the next year, okay? And God says, if you're faithful to follow my commandments and choose to trust me, I will provide, right? And so this was, again, like the manna tested the children of Israel's faith. God was testing their faith. Will you trust me? Just like you work 6 days and rest on the Shabbat and you don't work, will you trust me and work the ground for 6 years and rest for the 7th? That was a great act of faith. Israel basically never kept this commandment, right? That's part of the reason why in the days of Jeremiah, the children of Israel actually go into the Babylonian exile for 70 years, because they ignored the sabbatical year. For every sabbatical year that they ignored it, they went into exile. Okay? So they were like, the generation that took the land were like their ancestors, right? Most of the generation that came out of Egypt died in the wilderness because they didn't hearken to the voice of God and obey his commandments. The generation that went in and took the land, the majority of them as a whole didn't keep the sabbatical, and they ultimately didn't get to keep possession of the land. And in the same way, Yeshua was teaching his disciples, like he tried to teach the children of Israel in the wilderness. And when they were to go into the land, the Lord wanted the disciples to rest and trust in him. Rest and trust in him. 7 is about trusting God to possess your promise in face of the improbable and impossible. 7 is about trusting God to possess your promise in face of the improbable and the impossible. Say, I will trust God. Say, I will trust God and enter into the 7, enter into his rest, so that I can possess my promise in face of the impossible. I will trust in the face of it all, no matter how crazy it might seem, right? I mean, think about it. God tells the children of Israel, this is what we just talked about on Tisha B'Av, go in and you're going to take the land from the giants. Crazy. How are they going to take the land from the giants? How are you not going to sow in the 7th year, okay, and have food to eat, right? Will you trust God? See, you'll never have rest if you don't have trust. Trust leads to rest. If you can learn to trust God, you will have spiritual and emotional rest, because you'll be able to give the fear and anxiety over to him and not have to carry it over yourself. There's so many times, though, people can't move from the 6 to the 7. They can't. Slaves work 6 years. You work 6 days of the week. You rest on the seventh, right? If you can't move from the 6th to the 7th, you're a slave in Egypt. You're a slave to the natural. You're a slave to your fear. You're a slave to your anxieties. You're a slave to the world. Say, I will not be a slave. I'm moving from the 6th to the 7th. So 7 is about trusting God to possess your promise in face of the improbable and the impossible. Think about the number 7, right? Think about they go in to take the land, right? Think about it, right? There are 7 Canaanite peoples living in the land. And God tells them to go in and march around the walls of Jericho 7 days. And on the 7th day, they're to march 7 times. And there were 7 priests holding 7 shofars. And after the 7th circuit around the city, the walls came tumbling down. This was the beginning of the battle victory. But it's all centered around the 7. You know, it seems improbable, impossible. God, really? All you want us to do is walk around the walls 7 times, and on the 7th day, 7 times, and somehow, miraculously, the walls are going to come falling down? Yes, that's what God did. And the conquest lasted 7 years because basically God was saying, listen, trust me and I will give you rest from your enemies. So 7 is about trusting and resting, okay, in God in order to see his promises come to pass against all odds, okay? 7 is about trusting and resting in God to see his promises come to pass against all odds. There's no way that 5 loaves and 2 fish can feed over 10,000. This is against the odd. God loves to work against the odds.